Title of my lecture is Feminisms for the 21st Century. It's a deep honor for me to be able to address this gathering of militant women in struggle against patriarchy, capitalism, and authoritarianism. As we all know, this is an unprecedented time for our country. The BJP-led regime in power since 2014 at the center has already set up Hindu Rashtra to the north of the Vindhyas. There is complete subversion of the constitution, the selling of India's public assets to private capital, the privatizing of higher education, innumerable physical attacks against Dalits and religious minorities, especially Muslims, policing of women, and the use of labels like love jihad to basically control women's sexuality and mobility. The autonomy of states in a federal system has been eroded through policies like the National Education Policy. The end of Manrega and the new law that replaces it places the responsibility of funding on states, while the central government denies states their share of revenues from GST, for example. New labor laws have been passed which dismantle legal protections governing wages, job security, and working conditions that were won through prolonged and often bitter struggles by generations of workers. Most importantly, they place severe restrictions on workers' legal right to strike. The dual agenda of the regime in power at the center is to establish a violent authoritarian Hindu Rashtra and promote crony capitalism at every level. The latest development on the latter front is the National Green Tribunal that has dismissed all objections to the Greater Nicobar infrastructure project, which involves the felling of over 1 million trees, destroying the biodiversity treasure trove of Nicobar's rainforests, which is the ancestral home to communities such as the Shompen, whose survival is intricately linked to these forests. They will lose their language, they will lose their culture, and they are not considered to be part of the Indian knowledge systems that are being promoted by the central government. It is important to remember that the Hindutva-driven agenda of the Indian state is also rapaciously capitalist. So the attack on Christians, for example, in areas where India's indigenous people live in their mineral-rich lands, is not only against a religious minority, but against Christian priests and nuns who stand with the Adivasis in their struggle against dispossession. Father Stan Swami, who spent over a year in prison and died in jail at 84, is a tragic and inspiring example. In Kerala, you have your own struggles on different issues, and that is the healthy aspect of a democracy. There will never be a perfect regime, but as active citizens, we should be alert also to the fact that fascism is real, and it has already been established in the north of the country through electoral manipulation and street gangs. Criminal regimes such as that of the Uttar Pradesh government, criminal regimes such as that of Uttar Pradesh implement bulldozer justice, which targets Muslims in particular and the poor in general. Special intensive revision is being used as a strategy of mass disenfranchisement. This is the India in which I live, and this is the India of which Kerala is a part. What is the ideal that can guide us in our struggles against all kinds of injustice? Let us take seriously, first of all, the idea of constitutional morality. This is a term that B.R. Ambedkar used in his speech, the draft constitution, which he delivered on 4th November 1948. Three strands can be identified in this idea: freedom and self-restraint, recognition of plurality, and third, suspicion of any claims to singularly and uniquely represent the will of the people. These are the essential conditions of a democracy: mutual respect for one another's rights, acceptance and protection of a plurality that is not closed. That is, more and newer pluralities and identities can emerge. And third, no one movement or party or government can claim to fully represent the will of all the people. In 2009, Justice Shah's court decriminalized sex between consenting adults of the same sex. At that time, the judgment invoked constitutional morality again. This reading added another dimension to it, contrasting it to popular morality. Popular morality is shifting, subjective, and changes with time, but constitutional morality, in this understanding, represents the fundamental values of the Constitution. These values have come to be understood in mass movements of the 21st century in India as the values embodied in the preamble: justice, equality, liberty, and fraternity, which we can understand most generally as mutual solidarity. Underlying these values is the idea of freedom, which Ambedkar too had indicated. The word azadi has reverberated across India in the past few years in an unexpected afterlife reincarnated after the anti-imperialist struggle when azadi meant freedom from British rule. But now we understand azadi in very complex ways. It's azadi from, azadi to, azadi in. Azadi takes on different meanings, different layers in different contexts of protest. We also heard it in the struggle against the violently authoritarian rule of the Islamist regime of Iran, where the women slogan was Zan Zindagi Azadi, women, life, freedom. This word Azadi reached the Indian women's movement through solidarities between feminists across the barbed wire borders of nation states. It was first heard by an Indian feminist, Kamla Bhasin, in Pakistan, where the women were chanting it against the authoritarian regime of Ziaul Haq. It then comes back to India, and in 1984, it becomes a slogan in India, Azadi. For most thinkers of the global south, where we are, that is below the equator, the countries of the global south, freedom is never thought of as an individual value. Freedom is always a community value. Freedom is never just freedom from colonial rule, but freedom to build a new, just society. So for Ambedkar, revolution alone would not bring about freedom. A social revolution was required. And for feminism, that goes beyond a narrow liberal interpretation. Freedom cannot be only about individuals, but is inevitably linked to the community. Single individual women cannot be free. Patriarchy has to end for any one woman to be truly free. In India, despite all its mistakes, the women's movement has shifted its understanding from recognizing more than two genders to understand Savarna and class privilege. And now, so this is the situation in which we are. This is the India in which we all live. Although this state is different, and we all know it's different. But I would like us to think about something hopeful for the future. And there are many things we can talk about. But for the purposes of this lecture, I will pick up some issues and talk about how we could be reimagining them. I think in this gathering, these discussions are already taking place. So I'm not necessarily bringing something new to you. I'm trying to take part, I think, in conversations that are already going on in gatherings such as this, in organizations such as this, in movements such as this. The Asha workers' struggle raised many of these issues, actually. So the first question that we want to take up as feminists is the sexual division of labor. How feminists look at it and how it globally undergirds not only patriarchy, but also class and caste inequalities. What do we mean by the sexual division of labor? It is the understanding that the work of production and the work of reproduction should be sexually divided. The work of reproduction involves not just pregnancy and giving birth to new laboring bodies, but reproduction includes the reproduction of labor power, by which strength of the labor is replenished. That is housework, cooking, cleaning, etc., looking after children. Reproduction is assumed to be in the private domain, and production is supposed to be in the public domain. But we all know that most women actually function in both domains. But more importantly, what we are thinking of as the private domain is actually very public, because this unwaged labor is what is the basis of profits for employers, as they are not paying for a large part of what the worker needs. So the sexual division of labor ensures that women perform this labor for free. Either they do it for free in their own homes, or they perform this work for a very small wage in other people's homes as well as in their own homes. There's a caste dimension to this because those who perform domestic work as wage laborers are not only poor, they're often from the non-Savarna castes. They could be Dalits or OBCs, but even if they are not, there's a definite caste division in the performance of this labor. What is our alternative vision? What is the way in which we can rethink this? To begin with, we need to recognize that sexual division of labor is as much of a compulsorily and violently enforced institution as caste is. It is not optional for women. It is not voluntarily chosen. Women who refuse to perform this labor are emotionally and often physically coerced into adhering to these norms. This compulsory institution ensures that all women are affected in their public roles to some extent. If they are higher up in the class ladder, they are affected to it by a lesser extent, but they are still affected. Once we start recognizing this as a violent and compulsory institution, we can start thinking about how we can socialize this labor. It is at this moment private. Every woman does it in her own home. How can we socialize this labor? We often use the term human resources for people, although I don't like to use that. But if these resources are to be used by the state, then the state and society also have a responsibility for ensuring that these facilities are available at all workplaces. This is part of the work, I think, that ASHA workers did and what happens in Anganwadis and so on. So if they have a responsibility for these facilities to be available at all workplaces, such a compulsion will generate a kind of ripple effect of employment also, because child carers will be employed at these facilities, their children can also be part of the childcare facilities, and this should be something like a common minimum program for all political interests across the board. And this is something that as progressive movements, we can push all political groupings to take on board. That is, we are talking about a world in which domestic labor is taken as something that is foundational to the building of society. It's not something extraneous. The second issue that I will address is that of sexual violence and sexual harassment, and how do we engage with these in a world in which we would like to look different. So we would, to begin with, press that there should be regulations in place to address sexual harassment and violence in every space. We should be making our roads safe and for public transport to be running at all times so that women can be on the roads at any time of the day safely. We need to have procedures and ways of dealing with such acts, and when these happen, we need to address them publicly. The only way in which we can deal with sexual violence is making sure there are multiple regulations in place which support the complainant and make the accused face certain and quick punishment. We don't need strong punishments. We don't need death sentences. We don't need longer imprisonment spells. It has been well established that stricter punishments do not lead to reduction of crime. It does not act as a deterrent. What we need is certainty and quickness of punishment if someone is found guilty. Cases cannot drag on for 7 years, 8 years, 15 years. You've all heard of Bhavari Devi. She still hasn't got justice, decades down the line. So this is one part of sexual harassment and sexual violence, but there's another part we have to insist on. That is that we have a right to be joyful. We have a right to be happy in public. The joyous aspect we need to emphasize is that women should not have to offer reasons for being in public spaces, for just loitering. ഞാൻ ചെറിയ കുട്ടിയായിരുന്നപ്പോൾ ഈ തെണ്ടിത്തിരിഞ്ഞ് നടക്കുക, ഇത് എൻ്റെ അമ്മ പറയാറുണ്ടായിരുന്നു, തെണ്ടിത്തിരിഞ്ഞ് നടക്കരുത്, വീട്ടിലെത്തണം. തെണ്ടിത്തിരിയൽ, ഇതിനാണ് ലോയിറ്ററിംഗ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ. വാട്ട് ഈസ് റോങ് വിത്ത് ലോയിറ്ററിംഗ്? സ്ത്രീകൾക്കും തെണ്ടിത്തിരിഞ്ഞ് നടക്കാനുള്ള സ്വാതന്ത്ര്യം വേണം, which basically means that we should be able to be present in public without offering reasons for why we are there. We need to think about how to make these public spaces joyous, heterogeneous, uh, not policed and controlled, accessible, not only in terms of gender, but also in terms of the disabled, the marginalized. It is an alternative dream, a vision where we want to conduct and counter and contest and transform societies which are driven by sexual violence. Punishment is important, but creating a society in which we can live freely is even more important. The third issue I will discuss is citizenship. And today we know that citizenship is a very, very crucial issue. Why is citizenship a feminist issue? Why is it a workers' issue? First, because citizenship is often weaponized to deprive people of rights and to exclude them rather than to empower. The shadow cast by the citizen is the non-citizen. In India, for example, the CAA and the NRC set up tests of citizenship that even middle-class people with multiple documents to prove who their parents are would fail. But we know this test is not being applied uniformly and seriously. It is largely being used to disenfranchise minorities, especially Muslims. Now, what is citizenship? What is the basis of citizenship in India is primarily based on proof of birth in a heterosexual, patriarchal, legitimate family. ഞാൻ ഇങ്ങനെ കാണിക്കുന്നത് because legitimate and illegitimate is something that we have to, as people on the left, we have to constantly question what is produced as legitimate and why is illegitimate bad. There's a beautiful saying by French philosopher Romain Rolland, and Devika will, it was not in my talk, but she will translate it better. He said, if order is injustice, disorder is the beginning of justice. So we have to think about these, so citizenship is primarily based on this kind of proof of birth, which assumes an order, which assumes a patriarchal social order. And we need to question the assumption of citizenship by birth and the biological familial foundation of citizenship. This foundation remains unthought and unquestioned even in the left, even among progressive narratives of citizenship. Compulsory heterosexuality undergirds most forms of identity, caste, race, and community. But birth in a particular kind of family is the quintessentially modern identity of citizenship. Why should the basis of citizenship be the naturalized notion of birth? We should think of alternative sources of citizenship rights. So one could be through claims to family ties, which are where the families are not based on patriarchy and heterosexuality. There could be heterogeneous and fluid forms of intimacy that refuse to be legible to the state. But more importantly, we have to be fighting for, on the left, citizenship to be located in the place where we work, in the place of labor, not the place which is the accident of birth. Why should we not cast citizenship rights within the frame of place of work, not place of birth? There's a famous Urdu poet called Rahat Indori, and his famous words, which have now got a new life because of anti-CAA protests. He said, "Sabhi ka khoon shamil hai is mitti mein." Sabhi ka khoon shamil hai is mitti mein, meaning the blood of each one of us is mingled in this soil. This indicates in my reading not just the shared blood of birth and martyrdom, but we can derive a different sense of ownership of India from Indori's stirring words if we read khoon as used in the common Hindi term khoon pasina, the blood and sweat of toil. If our blood and sweat is fused with this soil, then that far exceeds the mere accident of birth. We should take seriously the implications of the fact that the preamble of the Indian Constitution is in the name of we, the people of India, not we, the citizens of India. Of course, how will everyone be looked after? Resources are not lacking. We recently learned that the total income of 63 individuals in India was greater than India's annual budget for 2018-2019. 63 individuals' wealth was greater than the budget for the country for the year 2018-19. The organization which produced this report had its FCRA revoked and it has had to leave India. So it's not a shortage of resources. When there are subsidies for the poor, it's called vote bank politics. When there's subsidies for the rich, it's called development. And we know in Kerala, you all know that in Kerala, the children of immigrants from Bihar and UP get free education, everything else that residents of Kerala get. This is the ideal that we should be working for. There is no shortage of resources in India to ensure state funding for basic human rights. Many scholars and activists have suggested that we need a political practice that questions the very legitimacy of sealed national borders that we have come to take for granted over the last century. National border regimes must be opened up, as well as labor markets organized through them. There must be an end to discrimination based on one's nationality. These are the demands of the growing group of no borders activists across the world. That is the slogan, no borders. No human is illegitimate. No human is illegal. A radical political practice is called for, one that challenges the barbed wire borders of nation states. In conclusion, let me urge you all to, as I do, let us all value and protect at all costs the cultures of heterogeneity, equality, social justice and struggle that characterizes our Keralam. Cultures that the people of Kerala have built, cultures that you have built and generations before you have built. To value even the internal differences, debates, and quarrels within the left. You cannot imagine what a luxury this is unless you have experienced the violent and stifling authoritarianism of Hindu Rashtra. The ability to disagree, struggle against, but continue to work for values we all cherish is one of the enduring strengths of Kerala, of which I hope to be considered a part. Ending on this note, I wish you a productive and exciting convention, one that builds and renews solidarities and strength. Lal Salam to all of you.